Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next instalment of Limelight Arts Travel's Talking Tour session. And today I'm joined by Dr. Nick Gordon, and we're going to be talking about Romania. So what I'll do is I'll start with an acknowledgement of country, and then I'm going to introduce Nick, and then he and I are going to have a chat about Romania. So Limelight Arts Travel acknowledges the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm hosting this online event today. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us on this session about Romania. And I'm going to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Nick Gordon. Nick Gordon is a historian with a PhD from the University of Sydney, specialising in the history of Europe in the Middle Ages and in the early modern periods. And he has taught history, particularly Italian history, but also Western European history, architectural history, and he's also known for his classes on art history as well. Nick is a practicing artist, and he is particularly known for designing and leading tours with a focus on contemporary art to art fairs such as the Venice Biennale, and also to art events such as Art Basel in Basel as well as in Hong Kong. And Nick is a director here at Limelight Arts Travel, and he designed and leads our tour to Romania. In fact, he led our first tour to Romania this year, and he's leading the tour there next year, which is already filling quite quickly. So it's a pleasure to be able to talk with Nick today about Romania as a destination, and to give you an opportunity to hear more from him and to find out what kind of a tour leader he is. Nick, thank you very much for joining us today, especially as you're beaming in from Innsbruck. So thank you for getting up early to make time for us
No
today.
problem. No problem,
So,
Kathleen.
Nick, you've got your coffee, I've got my cup of tea, we've got some talking points. It seems like a good place for us to start our chat about Romania might be with your background as a historian, because I'm imagining for most people, the history of Romania is something that they're less familiar with. Maybe, you know, they are familiar with Vlad the Impaler and not much else. So what was it about Romania that first piqued your interest as a historian?
It's an interesting question. I think it was mostly just that the more you're following into what's happening, say, in Central Europe's history, in the later Middle Ages and the kind of into the early Renaissance period, is that kind of Romania keeps popping up, and what's going on in Romania, which is where the border between Europe and the Ottoman world is. So the events that are happening there with people like Vlad the Impaler, but also people like Matthias Corvinus, becomes the king of Hungary, who later then conquers Vienna, takes Vienna off the Habsburgs for about 20 years. He's also Transylvanian Hungarian, so kind of part of what's now modern Romania. Stephen the Great, who's kind of wedged himself and has an enormous number of victories against the Ottomans time after time, as well as fighting off Matthias Corvinus, and kind of he's got the Poles to deal with as well. He's got Tartars in the other direction. So all these events that are happening in Central Europe, as the Ottomans are moving in and up the Balkans and in towards Central Europe, keep kind of funneling back to kind of Romania as a key place for where not just battles are taking place, but different ways of, I suppose, negotiating, I suppose is a polite word because it's not good for everyone, a kind of a border zone, which is convenient for Central and Northeastern Europe to have, and for the Ottomans to have. So it becomes this interesting kind of in-between place between kind of these different imperial worlds.
I mean, you just said imperial worlds and you're talking about borderlands as well. And my knowledge of Romania is not particularly strong, but I do associate it with the Romans as well, and with being a kind of a borderland province that far back too. And it seems to me that there's almost a kind of a continuity for us in as Westerners, that we think of Romania as kind of the farthest flung reaches of a frontier. I'm thinking about Dacia and Ovid, being exiled there. Has that been a kind of an idea that we've had about Romania that influences, do you think, how we see it today? Is this part of the reason why we know it less as a destination?
I think there are lots of things going on there. So I think there's some awareness of Romania having been kind of the northeastern border, I suppose, of the Roman Empire. And the Romans were primarily interested in Romania's natural resources, its gold mines, its salt mines, and not much else. So the Romans were there for long enough to be able to secure what they needed in terms of resources from the Dacians, who were kind of the people living there prior to the Romans. But it was also one of the places that was one of the first places to leave the Roman Empire as it started kind of retreating in Europe, which is interesting today because Romanian as a language is the closest living language to Latin. It's quite funny that you can see kind of parts of the language that kind of you can see, yes, that's definitely a modern Romance language, but then it has things like cases, which no other Romance language has. So you have to remember, I don't know, 18 different endings for every single verb just to be able to compose a sentence and kind of get it right. So it does have that aspect, which has become a part of, I suppose, our sense of Romanian national or cultural identity, which starts appearing kind of in the 15th and 16th centuries, when scholars in Romania are starting to kind of emphasize the Romanness of the country, the Romanness of the language. But at the same time as they're doing that, they're also, and this is, I think, significant for us and how we understand the country is slightly exotic, kind of very kind of Eastern, even though it's very European, is they're also very aware of their non-Western and non-Roman traditions as well. So referring back to kind of Dacian traditions and customs, through the influence of the Greek Orthodox Church and Byzantium. And they're aware that those have different ways of organizing people into societies, different understandings of political structures. So you start seeing the emergence of this identity as something that is part Western, part Eastern, but neither, independent of both. So I think that's something that when greater knowledge of Romania starts occurring in the West in the 19th century, particularly when Paris is becomes a key Romanian intellectual center. And that's significant because it's not just Romanian speaking Romanians, that's also German speaking Romanians, Greek speaking Romanians, Hungarian speaking Romanians, kind of, I suppose, entering the West and becoming part of the West's intellectual life, but they're doing so in a way that kind of reflects, I suppose, a type of exoticism, that they're from this far-flung place called Romania, which no one really knows about, which has different customs, different ways of dressing. We don't necessarily even know what language somebody will speak when they come from this place, because there are so many different cultural influences joining together in one country today.
Picking up on some of the threads there, looking at the kind of modern identity of Romania, and I don't know, maybe people like me who have an interest in fashion, one of the things I associate Romania with is a kind of a traditional style of embroidery and embroidered garments. And there's a kind of a medieval, for me, aesthetic to that artisanal folk culture quality. Thinking about the Dacian kind of removal from the Roman Empire reasonably early on in that process of the empire crumbling a little bit, how did Romania navigate that period of the High Middle Ages, or what we might call the Dark Ages? You've suggested that to Rome, modern day Romania, that area was interesting from kind of a perspective of natural resources. But I am imagining, I don't know, but I'm imagining that it was also hooked into certain aspects of the amber route and trade in natural resources from other places as well that were being circulated around Europe in the Middle Ages. How did Romania play out? You've talked about Byzantium, for example. Did it kind of transition into being part of the Byzantine Empire?
It's an interesting question. There's
Sorry,
a no, no,
sorry, a bit too
it's
elaborated.
I'll pick up firstly just on the comment about kind of traditional patterns and embroidery in fashion. And it's very unself-conscious that kind of you do see Romanians wearing Romanian embroidered stuff, not because they're trying to look like a peasant, because those patterns are also used in very contemporary design as well. So those designs come from a Romanian folk culture. And some of the earliest traces, and it's quite amazing, is there was a very well-established agricultural society living in kind of what's now northeastern Romania, across what's now modern Ukraine, and into parts of kind of that part around the Black Sea, which was a very sophisticated agricultural economy, settled cities, and those sorts of kind of geometric designs appear right throughout that group's pottery. However, that culture is entirely extinguished in a very brief period. And the current theory amongst some archaeologists is there was an invasion of people from the east, probably horse people, who just burnt everything and completely destroyed this culture.
Which people,
Nonetheless,
sorry, I just didn't catch that. Invasion from the east of.
we don't know who it was. It's more than 5,000 years ago. So it's kind of a very interesting prehistoric culture about which we know very, very little, except what survives archaeologically and what survives in their pottery. And a lot of those traditional designs and a lot of those geometries continue, but we don't know how they continue because that society seems to have been entirely destroyed. So it remains a bit of a mystery. But I suppose there's a theme that runs through Romania's early history, its ancient through its medieval history, right up actually to around the 18th and 19th centuries, is that there is a very strong folk culture, effectively peasant cultures, a culture of the village, people living off the land as farmers, mostly as a small plot farming, even when there are larger lords who are kind of become significant landowners. And that culture is largely ignored by whoever the overlord is. So it's not so much Byzantium in Romania. Parts of it are connected to the early kingdom of Bulgaria, but that very quickly retreats back behind the Danube, to the south of the Danube. You get kind of different groups, different landholders. You get this very kind of fluid system of governance, where it's kind of basically a big black hole that's not very well documented, of local lords negotiating amongst one another for a kind of an overlord, using a Byzantine structure and using a Byzantine language for understanding these relationships, but not actually being part of the Byzantine world. Later on, when you start getting the influence of the different empires who want control of that land because of its trade routes, because it has access to the Black Sea, access to the Danube, an incredible amount of natural resources, you tend to see these powers come in, but they don't really interfere so much with the folk culture, the peasant culture. They become kind of distant overlords who don't really care much about what's going on, except for as long as they get their taxation in the form of often grain or horses, they kind of leave people alone. And this is partly an explanation for why the language has persisted, that you've had so many overlords, but the language is essentially a Latin language. It's the closest living language to Latin, even though it was only in the Roman Empire for a very small period of time. So that we have things like the language, but also the culture of the village, the culture of the peasant coming through in those traditional patterns that is largely ignored by the different rulers. They're not interested in what's going on in the village as long as they get their taxes. So the kind of this continues through the Ottoman period in different ways, where kind of the different degrees of involvement. Similarly, with when Transylvania is part of the Hungarian world, the majority of the population are Romanian, ethnically Romanian, but they're kind of largely ignored, both by the Saxons and the Hungarians. So elements of the culture, from its language through to traditional patterns, traditional crafts, even peasant religions, folk religions, persist because the people are largely ignored by the overlords, who are kind of interested in the land strategically and then interested in its natural resources, but not interested in actually really controlling what's going on a day-to-day level.
It's an interesting kind of situation that you're describing, in that those local associations allow for the endurance of language and traditions and styles and folk culture um, over a really consistent period of time, despite people coming in from outside to exploit rather, I suppose, than to colonize in a traditional sense of thinking about colonization as a way to also undermine local associations to create a kind of national impulse from outside. And thinking of places in southern Italy that have a similar kind of history of being part of a Spanish empire, but only for the purposes of exploitation, and therefore local language, local customs, particularly village focused, as you're saying, are able to survive intact into the modern age. I mean, you've led our tour to Romania this year, you're leading the tour next year, but you've been visiting Romania for years before you led the first tour there this year. What was it that kept you going back to Romania on your own time, outside of kind of work and touring commitments? Was there a particular aspect of Romanian culture that drew you in?
I suppose there are lots of things. One of the initial things that I found when I first went there was the architectural eclecticism, particularly in Bucharest. It's a very unique style of national architecture that kind of first emerges in the early 18th century, which then in the middle of the 19th century becomes, I suppose, the impulse for this a national style that develops in the southern part of Romania around Bucharest. And that style predates Art Nouveau by decades, but it's usually thought of as being, looks kind of like an Art Nouveau, where you've got all of these different influences drawing from Ottoman architecture, Renaissance architecture, Gothic architecture, and fusing them together. So you have these wonderful buildings, whether they're the surviving early Brancaviano style buildings from the 18th century, or whether they're the 19th century nationalist style, which are what you'd have entire suburbs built with these palaces, and every single one is different, drawing on a very playful attitude, different things, different cultural influences coming in. They tend to be asymmetrical. They tend to have a love of having a great turret, always off center, but never on the corner. Kind of these funny high pointed roofs. It has a very Gothic feel about it. You can kind of see where kind of that inspiration, I suppose, comes from for kind of a medieval Gothicism. In the kind of a modern version of it is drawing on this sort of Dracula style architecture, for want of a better term.
Is that partly also because their national architecture, modern national architectural identity is specifically trying to make that point about a long medieval period in which a Romanian core identity was preserved?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And it's self-conscious, but while they're doing it in the 19th century, the practitioners of this architectural style are also thinking forward to the future, that it's not just preserving a culture, that culture will evolve into the future and will continue to playfully adopt what it likes from other cultures it comes into contact with. So you suddenly find there are elements of Moorish architecture, elements of South American architecture being drawn into these buildings, and this kind of wonderful playfulness about it. So it was initially that, and that got me more interested in the place. Then part of it was also convenience. I needed to spend more time in Europe than my 3 months and 6 months would allow within the Schengen area. And Romania only became part of Schengen earlier this year. Meant that kind of was a very good place to go to keep my visa requirements below the threshold in Western Europe. And that meant that
Not
I could
anymore.
travel around. No, I could travel around the country. exploring its different aspects. And I suppose it has very distinct, the main regions are all distinct from one another historically, and they're all divided from one another by the Carpathian Mountains. So kind of you cross the mountains and suddenly kind of culturally it looks different, and you can kind of start pulling apart those different historical influences in the art, in the architecture, in the culinary culture as well.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that when you first started going to Romania, one of the things you commented on was how lively and cosmopolitan Bucharest was, for example. But you've just mentioned the Carpathians, and something that's really come through for me is I've seen your photos from the tour, and as I've looked at the materials that you put together when you were putting the tour on sale, I was really struck by the natural beauty of Romania as well, which was not something I had any knowledge or expectations of. So, can you tell us a little bit more about the geography and how that plays out on a road trip journey like this one?
Yep, sure. So one of the things I was looking to do while putting together the itinerary was to bring out a relationship that people have to the land, to the country, the beauty of the country, which is very, very strong, very powerfully felt. And that includes a love of seasonality, that it's only really somewhere like Japan where I've come across a sense of the importance of place and seasonality being very, yeah, being its central, I suppose, to a sense of cultural identity. So just putting together the tour, we were trying to kind of create this dialogue, I suppose, between these urban societies, but also the landscape that they understand their culture to come from, and the people of the village, those influences from the village, and that love of the landscape. So the southern part of the country, we go south of the Carpathians down towards the Danube, kind of Wallachia or Matentia, is it's all very agricultural. It's kind of it's quite warm. It has long, dry summers. It's kind of perfect wheat growing territory, and you've got rolling hills that then move from crops into vineyards, and all kind of the southern foothills of the Carpathians are vineyards, and they're mostly producing varieties of wine that are a different branch of the enological tree. So they're kind of types of wine that are kind of effectively autochthonous to kind of Romania and Moldova, and they're fantastic.
Okay, good, because sometimes autochthonous is
Yes.
feels like a bit of a euphemism for undrinkable. Not in this
No,
case.
no. A friend put me onto it, working out that kind of an Australian's taste in wine would actually, especially if they're kind of used to drinking European, Western European wine, that Romania falls right in between, in that kind of it's not as heavy as Australian red wine tends to be, but it tends to be heavier than Western European wines that often feel like they lack body, lacking of kind of any depth to them. And that's partly the climate. It has quite a similar climate to wine growing territory in Australia. It's kind of long, dry, hot summers, and then cold winters. The grapes can properly hibernate. As you go up into the Carpathians, so the Carpathians make an interesting kind of shape like this through the country that separates the southern area from Transylvania over here. And the mountains there are spectacular. They come out of nowhere, and then they just, on the other side, they drop back down to the plains in Transylvania. And it's kind of a place where kind of there are monasteries, national parks. Most of the Carpathians are protected as national park. It's the largest single area in Europe where you have, I've forgotten the word they use for it, the UNESCO World Heritage listing for European forests that haven't been destroyed by thousands of years of logging and whatnot. So you have these primeval forests that run right across. Those forests are actually, interestingly, part of the reason why the Ottomans decided that Romania would be better as left as a border zone, because whenever they would try to attack whoever was ruling those regions, they would be taken into the forests. The territory behind them would all be scorched, so they have no fodder for their horses, and then they would just get massacred in the forest. So quite small Romanian armies have a long history of yes, kind of just entire Ottoman armies go into the forests and don't come back. So the forest has a part of the, I suppose, the national identity, and they're beautiful to walk through. They are, however, full of bears, lynxes, and whatnot. So you've got to be a bit careful. Anyway, then you move over into Transylvania, and part of what makes Transylvania different from the part to the south and the part to the east is that it has historically been much more closely connected to Western Europe, both through the rule as a part of the Kingdom of Hungary. So you start seeing Gothic-influenced architecture or Gothic architecture, but then also to protect those passes that connected, I suppose, Central Europe to the Balkans and to the Byzantine and Ottoman worlds. You then had Saxons were brought in both as knights and merchants to form these fortified towns, and this chain of fortified towns right across the mountain passes in Transylvania. And these are beautifully preserved fortified towns. Some of them, such as Brașov, became quite substantial Saxon German-speaking towns. Very, very wealthy because they control the trade routes across the Carpathians. But they also then they have their own weirdnesses. So although they're part in the 16th century, although they're part of the Catholic Kingdom of Hungary, a lot of the German townsmen and knights convert to one form of Protestantism or another. So you start having these Protestant German towns in a landscape that is controlled by the Catholic King of Hungary and a population who are, the majority of the population are Romanian Orthodox. So you get these little isolated towns which are ruled by German merchants, Saxon merchants, who are often then forming, there's a specific order of Protestant knights that were made to protect the border from the evil Ottomans to the south. And they're still around today, and they still turn up in their churches dressed up in their medieval robes. So it's quite quirky and interesting in that respect. Then as you move further north and to the northeast, you cross over the Carpathians again into a small territory, Bukovina, which is part of the world of Moldavia, not Moldova. Moldova used to be part of Moldavia, but it was sectioned off by the USSR and turned into its own separate republic. But Moldavia used to be one of the consistently powerful and independent parts of what's now modern Romania. And through the Carpathians, there are these beautiful monasteries that are often in quite remote places. They are in valleys that are communication and trade routes through the mountains, but they're all very heavily fortified, and the monastery churches are entirely frescoed inside and outside.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, it's something I've wanted to know about those exterior. I think the images of the exterior frescoed churches are really striking because most of us are used to internal mural paintings in churches in Europe, but exterior murals are quite unusual, usually for kind of atmospheric or climatic reasons. But why are they frescoed? Why are those churches and monasteries frescoed on the outside? It's so distinctive.
It is. There's a couple of, it's partly because the exterior of the church was visible, so it becomes a good place for storytelling, both theological storytelling, but more often political storytelling. So that they were places which were designed so that the population would be able to retreat. The rural population would be able to retreat inside the fortified monastery. They play roles as kind of a step above a parish church, so I suppose kind of a mother church for a region. So the local population would be seeing what's frescoed on the outside of the church as well as the interiors. But they're often quite political, and it's telling a story, I suppose, about resistance to Ottoman overlordship, or resistance to even the Tartars, and then later on you've kind of got the resistance to the Polish, the Hungarians, and the Russians as well. It's kind of this political messaging that's on the outside of the church, as well as stories that are told through saints that are actually about sending a dynastic message about the legitimate rulers of Moldavia.
Yeah, while we're in the political landscape as well as the natural landscape, I have a question for you, but I just wanted to let people who are watching know that they're very welcome to use the Q&A button to send through any additional questions that they have for you. Know, this is a destination that I think people are less familiar with. So if anyone who's attending live wants to take that opportunity to ask a question, please go ahead and do so, and I'll refer those to Nick. But I did want to ask, while we're in the political landscape and while we're talking about resistance, I think for many of us, communism is an enduring modern association with Romania. I remember as a teenager discussions in my own family about what could be done to assist, children in orphanages, specifically in
Yeah.
Romania, as the Iron Curtain was kind of retreating and people got a glimpse behind it, I think, for the first time in a while. What's your take on the modern political landscape of Romania, post-communism, particularly?
Okay. Post-communism, I suppose generally there's a cultural skepticism in Romania towards abstract political ideals, and that's partly a reflection of a village culture of just kind of what else does this person want? Kind of where's the concrete application of that? How's that actually going to work? But it's also in the case of Romanian politics, it's an understanding, I suppose, that politicians are politicians for a reason. They've got it. If they might talk big concepts, but they're actually just in it for themselves. There's a very strong skepticism. And that comes apart after communism, because throughout the communist period, Romania had kept itself with a separate political identity from the rest of the Soviet Union. So it's the only Warsaw Pact country that didn't join the invasion of Czechoslovakia. It maintained diplomatic relationships with West Germany and Israel. It was one of the negotiating partners between Israel and Egypt in the 60s. It's kept that, it was openly defying kind of what the USSR was saying it should be doing economically as well. It sought to make itself economically and politically independent of the USSR. So people like Ceausescu making overtures to the US and visiting the White House, and kind of that back and forth was very much anti-USSR policy. And that reflects a deep dislike of Russia that goes right back to the 18th and 19th centuries, when the Russian Empire starts picking bits of Moldavia. And you still find, say, the graffiti in Bucharest by the right-wing graffitiists. Every country has them. You find these phrases written around the place that Bessarabia is Romania. And Bessarabia, which is partly Ukraine, partly Crimea, partly Russia, has not been part of the Moldavian world for more than 300 or 200 years, not since the 1700s. And yet there's still this sense amongst the nationalist right that kind of, we own that, even though you haven't for a long time.
But that connects in interesting ways to what you've been saying about endurance and a culture of political resistance, and in some ways a kind of a conservatism about a Romanian identity. So that kind of hooks into that in interesting ways. What's the energy of Romania now? How would you characterize a city like Bucharest in terms of its energy?
Very cosmopolitan, very positive. It has this strange sort of, I know it's a place that I suppose for me is a place where you can still see kind of the life and decay side by side. So places like Naples, places like Kolkata have that kind of vibrance to them. At the same time as parts of the city are also falling down, new parts are constantly growing out. There's a confidence, especially amongst younger Romanians. And that confidence comes across as kind of, I suppose, they are Western and see themselves, they are part of a European world. but there's an attitude that you find amongst Europeans that they're still kind of looking down on them like children, as kind of they're not really grown ups yet. And there's a strong sense within Romania, dislike of that sort of, I suppose, being patronized by Western Europeans. So part of the energy, I suppose, is not trying to prove that they're Western European. It's more kind of asserting their independence more in how they dress, in their customs, in preserving a lot of customs, including kind of very formal interactions between people, a very courtly way of speaking, where people wouldn't, even if they know each other well, would still be referring to them as Mr. Such and Such, referring to each other by surname rather than first name. Very formalized, a kind of courtliness. And I think that's part of this. On the one hand, you've got this modernity and this drive towards a kind of a new future, but at the same time asserting their cultural roots as kind of yes, we're European, but we're not even trying to be like the French, for example. It's kind of we've got no interest in being anybody other than ourselves, I suppose. And that comes across interactions with the EU, for example.
How does this translate for a visitor to Romania, a cultural traveller such as ours in Romania? What were people's experiences on the tour this year?
The greatest thing I think surprised people, other than that the country isn't entirely made of concrete, and that you don't see starving children in the streets, because it's not the 1990s at the end of a massive political collapse. Other than that, there's a degree of wealth floating around. So per capita, Bucharest is one of the richest capitals in Europe, and you see it. There is obvious wealth. There is new development. It's not a kind of a nouveau riche development as well. It's kind of people are actually used to having money.
What's that grounded in?
Pardon?
What's the sorry, what kind of industries or professions is that wealth, that kind of stable wealth? What's it grounded in?
All sorts. So it does have a very strong agricultural economy. It has a lot of natural resources, including some of Europe's largest oil fields, oil and gas reserves, gold, silver, other kind of ores from the mountains, manufacturing. So it developed its own manufacturing base in the 1960s and 70s to try and modernize, which the USSR didn't like. It wanted it just to be a grain belt. But that industrial capacity has survived communism and grown afterwards. So you find kind of companies that might be Western European based, the Longi, for example, it's manufactured in Romania. Car parts are manufactured in Romania. So these German and Italian brands sell themselves as being German or Italian, but they're made in Romania because it's cheaper. Even Italian truffles, because the EU allows you to water down the origin of something. So it only needs 30% of the truffle to come from Italy. The rest of it comes from Romania. So they've got quite strong industries, which are providing for this wealth. So they're across agriculture, resources, and manufacturing. They've got quite a strong export economy, I suppose.
Yes, I think you and I have both worked with a coach driver in northern Italy who has railed about the introduction of Romanian truffles into North Italian restaurants in place of local Italian ones. The Bucharest, as you're describing it, sounds like a very attractive kind of haven. And we've had a question from Elizabeth about some of the less savory aspects of that in contemporary Romania. People who are listening might be, as I am, for example, I do now unfortunately link, what's his name, Andrew Tate, with Romania. Is that the right misogynist? I get my misogynists mixed up.
No,
But
that's the right one. That's the right one. Yep.
The human trafficker, yeah. So Elizabeth's
The
asked
human
a
trafficker
question.
that
Yeah.
Romania was the first country to arrest and detain.
Okay, so that goes, I think, to Elizabeth's question, which is how do contemporary Romanians see both their current situation in terms of trafficking of humans and drugs and illegal activity that we hear about in our news bulletins in the West, and also
Yep.
what's their view of their more recent history? So, how do they see, for example, the Ceausescu period?
Interesting question. So, in terms of attitudes towards human trafficking, there's a sense that with the fall of communism and the economic collapse that had happened prior to the fall of communism, all that privation in the last decade of Ceausescu, that there was a lot of exploitation of people coming from outside of Romania, working through old networks for human trafficking to provide sex workers for Western Europe, essentially. And the demand is coming from Western Europe, it's not a local demand. So there's a sense of resentment about that, but also when it comes to, I suppose, law enforcement, Romania had a very, very strong law enforcement system at the end of communism, and those things don't disappear overnight. So the difficulty for new networks, or the ability to stomp down on new networks, was quite good. So you find, for example, very little in terms of drug usage in Romania compared to Western Europe. You don't see people dealing on the streets. You don't see a lot of evidence of violent crime. It's essentially very, very peaceful, and in that respect, relatively well governed. Although if you mention anything about being well governed in Romania, you'll be told all the problems with government, because people are very aware of all the problems, the failings of their government. There's as well, I suppose, part of the legacy of communism too was to basically provide housing and employment for everyone. So you find that communities, particularly say the Romani, for example, in Romania, you still see there are still some who are itinerant, and they set up camps, and you see them kind of going through as you do elsewhere in Eastern Europe. It's kind of there they are. There's the horses, there's all the caravans, there's the camp being set up. But the majority of the Romani population are integrated. So they kind of identify as Romani, may speak Romani, but they live the same way in an apartment, with kids going to the local school, working regular jobs like everybody else. So that's another interesting aspect, and I suppose part of the communist legacy was it did supply a huge amount of housing, and did kind of make efforts to ensure that people had a very minimum level. At the same time, the communist elite, as everywhere else in the communist world, the communist elite live a completely different lifestyle, and people are very aware of their continuity, that those people who had the money because of communism and their role within the party still have the money today. And that's kind of something that people are aware of in the country.
I'm keeping an eye on the time because we try to keep these sessions to about 50 minutes. No, it's good. We're approaching that mark, so I'm just giving you a kind of an early time warning. Thinking about what you've said about Romania being quite proud of the traditions that it preserves, but also looking forward to a quite vibrant contemporary future. As a traveler in Romania, is there a kind of an openness and a pride about those traditional and well-preserved aspects of culture? Are they shared with travelers, or are they something that the Romanians are seeking to reserve for themselves?
I think on the whole, they are things that are shared with travelers. That kind of people, you can see the obvious pride that you're interested in their culture, in the heritage, in the history behind that culture, that you appreciate the natural beauty of the place. So you do get a very strong sense of wanting to share, wanting to make it other people understand where they're coming from. you also get a very strong sense of that pride not being for show. That one of the things that everyone I know who's been to Romania says is there is no rubbish. It is extraordinarily clean. And there aren't you can't walk around anywhere in Western Europe without noticing people just leave their crap everywhere, all over the place. There, so in 2 weeks with a group there this year, somebody found a single banana peel that wasn't in the bin. And that was remarkable because that was the first piece of rubbish not in a bin that had been seen in 2 weeks. And that was left by a school group who were just leaving a monastery. So kind of some teenager hasn't learned not to leave rubbish on the street yet because it's rude for the neighbors.
Youth of today, mutter,
Exactly.
mutter.
Yes.
What is Romanian cuisine like? Is that an aspect of local culture that's proudly shared as well?
Definitely. It's a cuisine that is rooted in agricultural traditions, but also so you do kind of get things that are quite the use of cream, but a lot of vegetables, a range of vegetables. There's always a soup of some sort that you would start with before moving on to kind of meat and vegetables, and then to a dessert that will be kind of using the region's fruit, because it has amazing orchards and berries and kind of a very fruit focused dessert. But it also has all the other influences. So kind of you get the influence of the Ottomans in some of, say, the lamb and dishes, some of the salads, the fact that kind of on almost any meal, you'll just see that kind of there are those nice yellow chilies and bits of a red onion that are left there that you just chew on as a snack to go with the meal. You get
that would make you very happy, and you've said a very positive trigger word for all of our group members, which is salad. Because probably the question we get more than any other question is where are the vegetables? So you're describing a vegetable heavy cuisine. You're making people happy.
And the certain meat as well, but kind of vegetables. And kind of it's interesting. So kind of when a particular vegetable is in season, you'll find that the local equivalent of a 7-Eleven has a sack, which they look like they've come straight from an grandma's field. So you'll have sacks of celeriac, or kind of, this is the weeks where all the leeks are coming in. So there are just piles of meter-long leeks stacked, and they cost next to nothing because it is something that they just brought them in from, I don't know, grandma's farm. And you do actually...
If they've got sacks of potato as well as meter-long leeks, I should get myself to Romania as soon as I can. Some of what you're describing is kind of connecting for me to aspects about traveling in Japan, which I find quite interesting. You know, proud preservation of local tradition, a very proud gastronomic heritage, vegetable-based, preserving something for yourself, but being really authentically proud to share it with other people. What kind of, I mean, for most of us, I think we would think of Romania as an emerging destination. That's how we would describe it in kind of travel language. And I think when some of us hear the words emerging destination and then post-communism, when we put those things together, we think we're going to be staying in a concrete bunker for the duration of the trip. So can you just say something about what kind of hotels the tour stays in?
Yep. 4-star hotels in Romania are the same quality of 4-star that you would expect right across Europe. If you're going to smaller hotels, it has had traditionally a very strong domestic tourism market. So you do get a lot of smaller boutique hotels, but they might only have 5 or 6 rooms. But the more modern hotels they're well equipped, they're thoroughly modernized. One of the things that it does surprise people is the internet speed in Romania. Romania has some of the fastest internet access in the world. It's quite literally more than 10 times fast than a good connection is in Australia. It's kind of insane. There is no swirling wheel. You click on a file and it's open straight away. It's kind of wonderful.
Very helpful for people on a tour who are also trying to keep up with work while they're away, like you, for example. I've got two final questions for you, Nick, as we run to our time limit. The first one is a very kind of, I think you've actually already answered it obliquely, but I'll just put it out there because it's a question I think that people have. A lot of cultural tour operators pair their tours of Romania with Bulgaria, but I remember how convinced you were that that was not the way you wanted to introduce people to the destination. Can you say something about that?
Yes, yep. Bulgaria has only and Romania have very, very different histories, even though they share a border. Their post-communist life toward is also very, very divergent, whereas kind of Bulgaria has got poorer and poorer and poorer. And when you cross the border, you notice the roads stop working, the sites are badly maintained. Romania has a much stronger economy because of it's a more independent form of communism, and that's its growth after communism has been quite extraordinary. So they're historically the two places are not very well linked at all. It's also, if you go to Bulgaria and Romania, chances are you won't get very far north of Bucharest or Brasov, and that means you'll miss most of Transylvania. You'll miss those northern regions around Bukovina and Moldavia, which are exceptional, from World Heritage sites to different cultures, fascinating history, buildings that you just won't see anywhere else. And that's partly because it's the travel times in Romania are quite long because the distances are much larger. One of the things that we have to keep in mind is that Eastern and Central Europe, Eastern European countries are actually a lot larger than we think they are in terms of the distances. You can't go very far without having to cross mountain ranges. And once you start getting to those more remote regions, the highway will be a single lane in each direction. And you may have to be sharing some of those in the remote regions. You're sharing those highways with horses and carts.
I thought you
Which
were
is,
going to say tractors, but that's
I
even
know,
better.
one of the best things about a horse and cart, I hear, and why peasants are continuing to use them, is the price of fuel. The price of diesel in Europe means that horse fodder is cheaper than diesel. So just keep the horse.
Well, I was going to say that because when we do plan itineraries, we look very closely at coaching days and coaching times, partly to a view to people's comfort, partly to a view to maximize what they can see, but also with a view to reducing coach hire because of the extraordinary cost of fuel. So yeah, maybe that's an idea for a very slow tour of Romania by horse and cart. My final question for you, Nick, is something that I know all of us in the office, when people get back from a tour, we love reading in the client surveys what the highlights were. I mean, we also, honestly look at the lowlights very closely too, because we like to minimize lowlights. But I think all of us are always so intrigued by the highlights of a tour, and often people in a group kind of coalesce around similar highlights. And so there's a divergence of opinions, but some things really always leap out as being a highlight. This is your opportunity. What's the highlight of the Romania itinerary for you? One thing.
Oh, geez. One thing. I only get to pick one thing.
Yeah, and I didn't
Um,
I didn't tell
okay,
you
well,
this
the
question was
highlight
coming.
for me as a tour leader is the surprise that people get each day of there's more and it's different. So that's the highlight. The highlight for me is not a place; it's seeing people have that experience of discovering something that they didn't anticipate would exist. Whether that's a city like Cluj, which no one knows where it is or what it is, and then they get there and love it. To kind of going up into some of the villages and just kind of watching people suddenly kind of their eyes open to kind of what they can see and experience.
That's great. Thank you very much, Nick. I'm glad seeing how enthusiastic you are about Romania. I'm glad that we're sending you back there in May 2026. And it's been great to talk to you about the destination and learn more about it and about your passion for it. I think the next session of these talking tour conversations that we have is, if memory serves, on the 23rd of September, where I'll be talking to Dr. Louise Marshall about medieval art in Burgundy, another conversation that I'm looking forward to. Hope to see more of you there. And Nick, thanks again for tuning in the morning in Innsbruck before you go and pick up your tour group later today. Thanks very much
No
for
worries.
making the time.
No worries.
Thank you very much, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at a future session and maybe even on tour in Romania. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon.